you cannot move on with your life. You cannot get beyond your crucible, title of the podcast, without forgiveness. And so sometimes blame is something like, I don't know, it's something that we want to hold and cling on to. We don't want to give them the satisfaction of, of forgiving them. If it's something that we've done ourselves, we don't feel that we're worth forgiving. And so really why we're talking about this is, if you don't forgive, if you don't try to stop blaming somebody, whether it's you, others, God, the universe, you can't move on. If you can't move on, you're in what we call a prison, in a sense of your own making, in this prison of bitterness and rage and anger. And that's not a good way to live. I mean, there's no way, if you're in the prison of resentment, that you can live a life of joy and fulfillment. It's just not possible. So we want to help people. We're dealers in hope. We want to give people hope here. And there's not a whole lot of hope when you're in the prison of blame and bitterness and anger.
That's absolutely true. And it's not, let's at the outset set the expectation here. Folks, if you're dealing with some unforgiveness, if you've got some things that are going on because of your crucible that it's hard to forgive someone, this is welcome to the club time, right? If it were easy, we wouldn't have to talk about it. It would be something that would be natural. It's not natural. Some of the things, some of the crucibles, some of the traumas, I called them traumas, tragedies, setbacks, failures at the outset. That's how I always introduce the show. It's not easy to find forgiveness. I did a lot of searching around on the internet for quotes about forgiveness, and we'll start off with this one from Indira Gandhi. Why is forgiveness so hard? This is what Indira Gandhi said. Forgiveness is a virtue of the brave. Ouch, right? There's virtue involved, and you got to be brave. And those can be things that can be hard to summon sometimes, and hard to manifest sometimes as you're moving forward. Is that true? That seems fair, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Indira Gandhi, just prominent former prime minister of India. Yeah, I mean, it does take courage. And, one of the things which I'm sure we'll get into, why is forgiveness so hard? Because sometimes, and we've had all different kind of guests on the podcast. Let's make it really challenging. Maybe you were abused growing up by a family member or somebody else. It's like, well, if I forgive, am I condoning it? Do I say it's okay? I want them to know that what they did just crushed my soul, crushed my life. And the tragedy of it is when, we think somehow by forgiving, we're letting the other person win. It's so often when people do bad things to us, this is galling, but often true, is they don't care if they know. It doesn't really worry them that much. It's galling. It's often the case that people that do terrible things, sometimes there's no remorse. And so we feel like, well, we have to hold on to this because we don't want to say it's okay. And that's where, and we've talked about this with multiple guests who've been through horrific experiences, and they've pretty much all agreed that there is a fundamental difference between forgiving and condoning. And that's something, it's actually one of the points that we'll get into.
Right.
But, you've got to, that's why Indira Gandhi's right, that it's, forgiveness is for the brave, because you've got to be willing to say, okay, what happened was not right, but I'm going to forgive because I have to do it for my own sanity. And it's, it doesn't, as we'll get into, it doesn't happen overnight. It requires, a bit like exercise, it requires a lot of work. And you often have to keep coming back to the well. But it's not easy. And sadly, so many of us choose not to go there. We just, I'm not going to forgive because I want to remember how much they hurt me, how bad that was, and I never ever want to forget. And for some reason they think by not forgetting, that's a good way of handling it. It's just fundamentally, you damage yourself. But it's somehow people say, no, I'm not going to forgive because what they did was wrong. And they can't get past that concept.
Right. And the ramifications of that affect both the individual who feels that way, and it can affect a wider swath of people. And one of the things we're going to move, as you've hinted at a couple times, Warwick, we're going to move into the details, the steps of overcoming that bitterness and that anger and embracing forgiveness that you've written in a blog that should be on crucibleleadership.com by the time you hear this, listener. If it's not, it will be there shortly. But I wanted to sort of paint a picture of what forgiveness looks like in action and what hanging on to anger and bitterness looks like in action. And it's not my picture. This is a picture by a man named Dr. Ketz DeVries, who, in advocating for a forgiveness culture, cited the contrast between the results of Nelson Mandela in South Africa, who was well known as he was imprisoned under the apartheid system. He was imprisoned for a very long time, finally freed, and then became the leader of South Africa. And contrasting him with Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, who handled things differently than Mandela did. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from what Ketz DeVries wrote to paint a picture of what it looks like to live in what he called a forgiveness culture and what it looks like to not, to get us started on this conversation. This is what DeVries wrote. When you fly over Zimbabwe, you see a wasteland. That's Robert Mugabe's country. When you fly over South Africa, you see something very different. Two leaders with very different attitudes toward forgiveness. DeVries was a teacher. He says, if I ask my class, which political leader do you most admire, 95% say Nelson Mandela. Remember, he did this research back when Mandela was still in power. When you ask why, the answer is forgiveness. At the end of South African apartheid and after 27 years in prison, Mr. Mandela forgave his oppressors and encouraged many of his party's members who clamored for revenge to do likewise, telling them, quote, forgiveness liberates the soul and removes fear. That's why it's such a powerful weapon. In comparison, Robert Mugabe opted for bitterness, vindictiveness, and hatred against white Zimbabweans and the nation's black citizens who opposed him. By encouraging supporters to forcibly occupy white-owned commercial farms, Zimbabwe, once the breadbasket of southern Africa, became the poorhouse. Under his rule, unemployment rose to between 70% to 80%. Life expectancy fell. In mid-November 2008, Zimbabwe's peak month of inflation was estimated at 6.5 sextillion%, making the national currency basically useless. That's the difference.